Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Forgive me if I sound a bit nasally today, I'm recovering from being sick yet again. What can I say? It's one of the many perils of working with so many people in real life. Anyway, in today's episode, I'll be covering a topic I've thought about doing for a while now. I'll be looking at some of gaming's biggest ripoffs, or in a friendlier way, shall we say games that were inspired by some other games. Well, they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. But who's they? My guess is people that have never been the victims of being ripped off. But anyway, in creative industries, it's common for new properties to borrow and build on what came before them. If we look at movies, if there was no Dances with Wolves, we couldn't have Avatar. If it wasn't for Rear Window, there'd be no Disturbia. If there was no Battle Royale, there wouldn't have been the Hunger Games, and so on. Often in creative industries, people see something cool and decide, hey, I like that thing, let's do something like that, but better. Now, cynical corporations may look at something and say, let's do something like that thing we noticed made some money, while spending as little of our own money as possible on it, thus maximizing the chance of turning a quick profit. Corporations. Is there nothing they can't figure out how to destroy? Anyway, today I'll be showing you 5 games in this video that inspired 5 other games. Enough talk, let's get on with it. First up, we've got Namco's Rolling Thunder. It was an undeniable Namco classic. Rolling Thunder is a side-scrolling action game where you have a gun with limited ammo, you can get a more powerful gun with its own set of limited ammo, you can duck into doors in the background to get more ammo, or a moment of safety. I mean, Rolling Thunder just felt very unique and had its own style and feel and controls and physics. And Rolling Thunder is also a very good game, but a super hard one. The difficulty still tends to put off a lot of people when they discover this game in this day and age. But if you stick with it, you can improve and make your way through this. Now, Rolling Thunder also got a somewhat ugly yet still pretty good playing NES port, which you're seeing for just a moment here. Yeah, it lost a lot of the visual detail from the arcade game, but it retained most of the gameplay elements pretty well, and is super fast. If you've ever seen any of the computer versions of the era, they are incredibly slow. Now, Rolling Thunder inspired quite a few other big games, the biggest of which is Sega's Shinobi, but that's not what I'm going to tell you about today. Shinobi actually added a lot of elements to the gameplay and managed to stand on its own because of that. But no, retro gaming fans, there's a much more egregious game that I can tell you about now. Feast your eyes upon this. Why, it's Codename Viper from Capcom, released for the NES in 1990. And guess what? When it comes to gameplay feel and the general play mechanics, this one could have easily passed as an official sequel to Rolling Thunder. Codename Viper just completely and utterly mimics the play mechanics and feel of Rolling Thunder, while making only very minor tweaks to the gameplay, doing things like allowing shooting while jumping and putting more stuff behind the doors, including a bomb that you need to find to exit every level. Now, Codename Viper is obviously a ripoff of Namco's title. I mean, reasonable people would look at this and think it had something to do with the original game if they didn't know any better. But nope. It's still a well-made game, and it looks a lot better than NES Rolling Thunder. But even while enjoying this game, it never quite shook that ick factor off of just being a complete ripoff. I've had Codename Viper since it was brand spanking new, and I liked it well enough in its own time, but it's not one that I've come back to often over the years. Now, if I want to play a Rolling Thunder-esque game, my title of choice is Rolling Thunder 2, which is the best game in the Rolling Thunder style if you ask me. Which, you didn't, but I told you anyway, so there. Okay folks, this here is Capcom's Mercs. Mercs was the first real sequel to Capcom's earlier overhead run-and-gun title, Commando. Mercs showed what was possible years after the early classic Commando, with the much more powerful CPS-1 hardware. And it's a great game. Mercs is my all-time favorite overhead run-and-gun shooter. It also got a great port to the Genesis that severely cut back on the graphics and was sadly only one player. But the gameplay was spot on, and it even included a full-blown original Mercs sequel right on the same cartridge. And while Capcom may have been the perpetrator of our last ripoff, this time they're going to be the victim. What you're looking at right now is Desert Breaker. Have you ever heard about this game? I covered it on this channel 4 years ago, back when I had about, 100 subscribers, so chances are you missed this one. This game was made by Sega, and was released in 1992. Yes, if you look at Desert Breaker here, you may notice it bears more than a passing resemblance to Capcom's Mercs. The Desert Breaker didn't see wide release in the arcades, and it was never ported to any home systems. When it comes to the essentials, visuals, sounds, and gameplay, Desert Breaker is an okay game. It's not as good as Mercs, no question about that, but it's also not bad. Now, Now, Desert Breaker has a few good ideas here and there, but the game is a pure quarter muncher and is brutally difficult. It just feels like a game that was specifically built to try its best to imitate a different game, and hey, what do you know? That's exactly what it is. Desert Breaker has 3 very long levels, and that's it. If you want to see my in-depth review of this game, you can watch my painfully old, cringy video, which I've conveniently linked below for you. It's not a game that I'd necessarily recommend. I mean, if anything, it's just a smidge above average. But if you want to see just how much Sega felt like ripping off Mercs, well, hey, go nuts. I'll also add, in terms of game quality in general, Desert Breaker is probably the worst title in this video. It just feels half-baked when you get down to it. It's interesting enough to check out, but I doubt anyone will ever want to play it over and over again. Alright, so most of you probably know about this one already. Here's Capcom's Street Fighter II. Well, specifically Street Fighter II Champion Edition. Champion Edition was of course the first official upgrade to Street Fighter II from Capcom themselves. And Street Fighter II, well, that game basically single-handedly revived the waning arcade market of the early 90s here in the US, and that is not an exaggeration. In the early 80s, what we often refer to as the golden age of gaming these days, it was not unusual to find long lines in arcades and supermarkets and pizza parlors and card stores of kids waiting to play stuff like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. This was a thing that actually happened. I lived through it and experienced it. But after home systems got more advanced and we had 16-bit consoles firmly established, the popularity of arcades was in steep decline. That changed radically when Street Fighter II came out. Suddenly the lines were back, and there was just a level of excitement in the arcades that had been missing for years. This continued with releases like the sequels to Street Fighter II, the Mortal Kombat series, and then the polygonal super games of the era like Daytona, Virtua Fighter 2, and more. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Behold! This is Fighter's History from Data East, released in 1993. Yeah, it looks suspiciously like Street Fighter 2. Now, I played this game a lot in the arcade when it was new. It was actually pretty decent, even though it was obviously a blatant ripoff of Capcom's mammoth industry-saving game. Speaking of which, Street Fighter 2 features 3 punch and 3 kick buttons, and you perform special moves, of course, by doing things like quarter circles followed by a button press, charging in one direction for a second or two and then pressing in the opposite with a button press, or, a myriad of other things. Can you guess Fighter's History's control scheme? 3 punch buttons, 3 kick buttons, the same basic special move scheme. Even the designs of several of the characters and their special moves closely resemble Street Fighter 2. The only thing that this game really added to the gameplay of Street Fighter 2 was destructible weak points on each character. Hit a weak point enough times, you break the weak point and the opponent gets dizzy. Dizzy, like they get in Street Fighter 2. Now, how much of a ripoff is Fighter's History exactly? Well, they even have 2 versions of each song in the game. A normal version, and wait for it, a critical version for when someone's energy gets low. Gee, what one-on-one fighter did that before Fighter's History? The world may never know. Anyway, Capcom sued Data East over this game's similarity to Street Fighter 2. It's a story that's been told many times now, but long story short, Capcom lost. The court decided the characters were generic enough that they were archetypes and that could naturally have been designed by anyone for any fighting game. Oh well, in our hearts, even those of us that enjoyed Fighter's History will always know it was a blatant ripoff of Street Fighter 2. I probably should have mentioned Fighter's History itself was ported to the SNES and arrived without much fanfare. Now, Fighter's History got its own sort of semi-sequel on the Neo Geo called Fighter's History Dynamite or Karnov's Revenge, depending on your region, and that game was also ported to some other platforms. You can think of that one sort of like Fighter's History Champion Edition. Alright, here's a game that might not be familiar to many of you. I don't know if anyone's ever seen it before. I think it's called Super Mario something. Anyway, this is Super Mario Bros. For the NES, of course, one of the most gigantic successes of the industry, and the game that made Nintendo a household name, especially here in the US in the mid to late 1980s. I mean, this game was so popular that out-of-touch adults called every game system a Nintendo for years after its release. If you were young and weren't alive back then when this stuff came out, you may think I'm exaggerating. And if you think that, well, you're wrong! Now, I'm not going to waste your time explaining too much about this game. It's a classic. You run, you jump, you eat mushrooms, and you murder a giant lizard either by burning him with fireballs or dropping him into boiling lava at the very end of the game. You monster! How do you live with yourself? But yeah, Super Mario Bros. Did for home consoles in America what Street Fighter II did for arcades around the world a few years later. It pretty much signified the end of the American home video game market crash. Note, we still had computers and computer games, but consoles were basically a dead market for a couple of years here. But that only happened here in the US. Everything remained fine in the other major gaming regions of the world. Now, feast your eyes on this! This is Great Gianna Sisters for the Commodore 64. This game was published by Rainbow Arts in 1987. Rainbow Arts was no stranger to ripoffs. I could fill an entire episode with their stuff. In fact, Rainbow Arts asked the developers of what will become Great Gianna Sisters to make a game as similar to Super Mario Bros. As possible. And, well, this is pretty damn close. One of the main developers was Manfred Trenz, who would go on to create the Turrican series. And another person involved was composer Chris Hulsbeck here, who go on to create the amazing soundtrack for the 16-bit Turrican titles, among many others. Now, you're not going to believe this, but Nintendo wasn't too happy when they saw Great Gianna Sisters. Crazy, right? Nintendo sent Rainbow Arts a letter basically telling them, hey, get your cheap Mario ripoff off of store shelves or we'll sue you. The letter itself didn't initiate legal action, but Rainbow Arts got the message loud and clear and pulled the game from store shelves. This wasn't the only time this happened to a Rainbow Arts title, but I've already told you about Catechus in another episode. Great Gianna Sisters has made sort of a comeback in recent years with slightly less infringing designs, and there are more recent titles that you can even still buy, modern sequels to this game technically. Oh, and here's a bonus for this episode. Back when Great Gianna Sisters was new, hackers of the day did this to it. This isn't modern, folks, this is from 1987. This has nothing to do with the port of Super Mario Bros. Released on the Commodore 64 a few years back. In fact, this game does nothing but reskin a few elements of Gianna Sisters to create this monstrosity. And this was actually how I first encountered Great Gianna Sisters. My friend had sworn that he'd played Super Mario Bros. On the C64 back then, and I called him a liar. One day he brought this over. I had to explain to him that this wasn't official, it wasn't a real game, but he didn't care back then. Oh well, I never held it against him. Alright, so I've covered a few games in this video you may have seen or may have heard of, so I'm going to show you one now that you may not have seen before. First off, this is Sega's Galaxy Force 2. I've covered this one a lot for a lot of different platforms. The arcade version was of course mind-blowingly incredible back when it was new, and felt like something from years in the future. It looks better than a lot of polygon-based titles that came out years after. Galaxy Force 2 was basically the ultimate Sega Superscaler title. Seeing this game in action, I can easily imagine a world where 2D scaling sprites have become the building blocks of 3D graphics instead of polygons. Even today, in late 2024 as I record this video, I think Galaxy Force 2 still looks incredible. And this came out in 1988. Yes, 1988. Some of the biggest games out that same year were Contra and Mega Man 2 on the NES. Now those are both great games, but look at this hardware that was out at the same time we had unwrapped fresh new copies of those classics. Galaxy Force 2 is awesome in the truest sense of the word. Now prepare to not be able to unsee this game. This is a title from Taito in 1991 called Galactic Storm. Taito decided, hey, why just clone the game when you can copy about half of the name also? Galactic Storm's graphics aren't done in the exact same manner as those in Galaxy Force 2. But still, there are some clear nods to Sega's ultimate superscaler title in this game. Undeniable, I'd say. The music even sort of copies the jazzy style of Galaxy Force 2. Certain enemies are almost identical. There are some environments that were more than just a tad inspired by GF2, and really the biggest changes that Taito made to this game are that the ship is too damn big, they replaced lock-on missiles with a few screen-clearing bombs, and there are no more speed controls. While I'll sing the praises of Galaxy Force 2's visuals anytime, the gameplay is admittedly good, but nothing super special on its own. Now imagine cutting out about, 2/3 of that game's play mechanics and calling it a day. That's essentially what Galactic Storm does. So if you thought the gameplay in Galaxy Force 2 was too shallow and you couldn't do a space shooter that was more shallow than that one, well, Galactic Storm comes along and says, hold my beer. And don't get me wrong here, Galactic Storm isn't a terrible game or anything. If you enjoy stuff like Afterburner and Galaxy Force 2, you'll probably like this game too, just not as much. It's basic, it's short, the frame rate wobbles up and down, and to date this has never been completely ported to a home system. So if you want to give Galactic Storm a whirl, your only options right now are real hardware or emulation. It's definitely worth taking a ride or two through Galactic Storm. It's not going to leave much of an impression though, and if you missed this one, well, you don't have to have any FOMO. It just isn't that good. It's okay. Alrighty folks, so there you are. 5 games that were total ripoffs of, well, 5 other games. Most of them were still pretty good, even though none of them were as good as the originals. Like I said at the beginning of this video, this is a topic I can revisit a lot. So if you enjoyed this one and want to see more of it, let me know. Tell me, what are some of the biggest ripoffs in gaming that you've ever seen? Were any of the games in this video new to you? Were there any games in this video that you've played and enjoyed more than the originals? Let me know all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, consider contributing to my Patreon, Ko-fi, or through YouTube channel memberships right here. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.